The snow didn't just fall that afternoon, it hunted. It came in sideways off the ridgeline, driving hard and flat across the two-lane blacktop of Route 14, packing itself into every crack and hollow, erasing the yellow center line, burying the mile markers, turning the entire mountain pass into a single featureless wall of moving white. The kind of storm that didn't announce itself politely, the kind that arrived like a verdict. Reese Calloway had been walking for 4 hours before it got bad. She had left the house on County Road 9 before first light, climbing out the ground floor window of the bedroom they'd given her, the one with the broken latch and the smell of mildew that never fully went away, no matter how many times she scrubbed the baseboard with the half-empty bottle of bleach she kept under the bed. She hadn't packed much. 3 granola bars from the kitchen cabinet, the kind with the chocolate chips that Dale never ate, because he claimed they gave him headaches, which was convenient because they were the only food in that house she could take without him noticing. A faded library card she kept for no reason she could name. The oversized corduroy jacket that had belonged to someone else long before it belonged to her, olive green and worn thin at the elbows, 3 sizes too large across the shoulders, the kind of garment that had lived several lives before arriving in her possession through the intermediary of a donation bin at a school she no longer attended. Her boots were the worst of it. Cheap imitation leather, the kind sold in wire bins at the back of discount stores. The left sole had separated from the upper 2 weeks ago during a walk across the frozen gravel of the school parking lot. She had wrapped it with duct tape, 2 strips crosswise and 1 lengthwise, and it had held through rain and gravel and the hard linoleum floors of 3 different school hallways across 2 counties. But duct tape wasn't designed for a Wyoming blizzard in the 3rd week of November, and she already knew without looking down that the adhesive was going brittle in the cold. She could feel it in the way the sole shifted slightly with each step, a micro movement that hadn't been there yesterday, a loosening that was patient and inevitable. She didn't stop to check. Stopping meant thinking about the cold, and thinking about the cold meant acknowledging how fast her body was losing the battle against it. The split on her lower lip was still fresh. She could feel it pulling each time she tucked her chin too deep into the jacket collar. A thin, sharp line of dried blood that had crusted overnight into something permanent feeling. Dale Pruitt's knuckles had found her jawline at about 9 o'clock the previous evening. A casual, almost bored backhand that had more to do with the empty whiskey glass on the end table than with anything Reese had actually done. She had broken a ceramic coffee mug earlier in the day, dropped it reaching across the dish rack while washing dishes after dinner. The mug had hit the linoleum and broken cleanly in 2. That had been enough. It was always enough. She had lain still on the narrow bed afterward, listening to the television drone from the living room, listening to the specific quality of silence that indicated he had passed out in the recliner. She had done the arithmetic she always did in those moments. The arithmetic of risk. The arithmetic of endurance. How many more mornings like this one? How many more evenings like last night? She had run the numbers before twice, and both times the system had caught her within 48 hours and returned her in the back seat of a county vehicle back to the same house, the same room, the same man who technically provided shelter and therefore technically qualified as a guardian under the definitions used by the state of Wyoming. This time she didn't run toward anything. There was no plan, no destination, no friend waiting 2 towns over with a spare couch and a warm meal. There was only Route 14, which she had reached by cutting across 3 frozen fields and a shallow creek bed that had soaked her boots through before she was a mile from the house. Route 14 led away from County Road 9, and that was the only qualification that mattered at 2 in the morning when she had climbed through the window. The gas station at the base of the mountain had been her last point of contact with anything resembling civilization. She had gone in to use the restroom and stood for a moment in the warm fluorescent light near the register, pretending to study a rack of road maps, letting the heat work into her fingers. The small television mounted in the corner near the ceiling was cycling through a local weather segment. The meteorologist had used the word squall. He had gestured at a swirl of pale green on the radar map and said the word with the casual confidence of a man describing minor inconvenience. Light accumulation. Clearing by evening. Travelers should use caution on mountain passes above 4,000 feet. Reese had looked at the sky through the station window at the flat gray front pressing down over the tree line to the northwest, and thought that it didn't look like a squall. It looked like something that had been building for a long time and had finally decided to arrive. It looked like the sky had made up its mind. She had walked out anyway. There was nowhere inside to go. The front hit her at almost exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, according to the cracked face of the gas station watch she wore on her right wrist. A digital watch she had found in a lost and found box at a school 4 placements ago and never returned because no one had come to claim it. One moment the air was cold and still with a thin, overcast light that flattened the landscape into shades of gray. 20 minutes later, the world had been replaced entirely. The temperature dropped hard and fast, the kind of drop that felt mechanical, like something being shut off. The wind came first, not from one direction, but from everywhere. At once it seemed slamming against her chest and her back alternately as the gusts rolled through the mountain pass in competing currents. Then the snow horizontal and dense, tiny hard crystals that weren't so much falling as being fired arriving at her face with the specific sting of something that intended harm. Visibility collapsed, 50 feet, 20 feet, then barely enough to see the tree line on either side of the road, dark shapes looming and disappearing in the white, like suggestions of trees rather than actual trees. The duct tape on her left boot gave out somewhere around mile marker 14. She felt it go, the adhesive releasing in a stiff, crinkled strip, peeling away in the specific brittle manner of something that had been asked to do more than it was made for. The sole dropped away from the upper with a wet, defeated sound she felt more than heard through the howling wind. Cold slush packed itself directly against her cotton sock. Immediately the shock of it sharp enough to make her breath catch. Sharp enough that she actually stopped walking for 3 full seconds before the forward motion of survival reasserted itself. She shortened her stride to compensate, dragging the loose sole rather than lifting it, keeping the foot flat and low to prevent the remaining adhesive from tearing completely. It wasn't a solution. It was a postponement of the reckoning. But postponement was something Reese Calloway understood from the inside out. She kept her chin down and her shoulders rolled forward and she walked. She was thinking about nothing in particular. That was a skill she had developed over years of practice in difficult rooms, the ability to empty her mind of everything except the immediate mechanical task to reduce her existence down to a single repeating instruction. Next step, next step, next step. Don't think about the cold working its way up your left ankle with the deliberate patience of something that has nowhere else to be. Don't think about the granola bars that aren't going to be enough. Don't think about where you're sleeping tonight or whether the county will post a missing persons alert or whether Dale Pruitt will even bother calling it in, whether it's worth his effort to report the loss of something he didn't much value in the first place. Just take the next step. She was deep in that empty mechanical rhythm when the sound came. It reached her through the wind at an odd angle, muffled and heavy, arriving not as a sharp crack, but as a dull, compressive thud, the sound of substantial mass meeting substantial resistance at speed. It was followed immediately by a lighter, higher sound unmistakable even through the storm's noise. Shattering safety glass, the specific bright cascade of a windshield giving way. Reese stopped walking. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. The wind was still screaming, the snow was still driving hard across the road. But underneath all of that, there was a void where additional sound should have been. No engine continuing, no horn, no voice calling out. Just the storm filling in the space where something had just gone violently and completely wrong, filling it in with the indifferent efficiency of a system that didn't distinguish between the dramatic and the mundane. She turned toward the right shoulder of the road. The embankment dropped away sharply, here a steep wooded pitch falling maybe 30 feet into thick timber before leveling into a drainage hollow she couldn't see from the road. Through the blowing snow, she could just make out the guardrail, a weathered steel barrier that ran along the shoulder in sections. One section was wrong. The near post leaned outward at an angle that hadn't been there before, wrenched from its footing by a passing force, and the beam between posts showed a fresh gouge in the galvanized metal bright silver against the old weathered gray. The kind of mark that gets left when several thousand pounds of moving vehicle glances off a fixed object at speed. She looked down along the embankment. There were tire tracks. Deep ones, the rear tires having spun hard enough to throw snow and gravel before the vehicle left the road, entirely digging channels that were already beginning to fill from the edges. The tracks dropped over the lip of the embankment and disappeared into the timber below. No taillights visible. No headlights cutting through the dark space between the trees. No engine sound rising from the hollow. Reese stood at the guardrail for 4 seconds. She counted them without meaning to, the way you count when your mind is running parallel processes, the surface mind counting while the deeper mind runs its calculations. In 10 minutes, the blowing snow would fill those tire tracks completely. Anyone driving past on Route 14 would see an unmarked shoulder and a dark tree line, and nothing else. Anyone driving past assumed the existence of other drivers, and she hadn't seen a vehicle on this road in over 2 hours. The storm had cleared the pass of traffic the way a hand sweeps crumbs off a table, clean and total and without particular intention. No one was going to find whatever was down there. No one except her. She thought about the cold. She thought about her left foot already soaking through the separated sole, already beginning the slow slide toward numbness that preceded the kind of real danger that ended conversations about other things. She thought about the distance to the nearest town and calculated roughly that she had perhaps another 2 hours of productive walking left in her body before the cold began making decisions for her. Every minute she spent on this embankment was a minute she was not spending walking toward shelter. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about something else entirely. She thought about what it felt like to be the person inside the wreck. She thought about what it felt like to be hurt and cold and alone in the dark, with the snow coming in through the broken windshield, and no sound except the wind waiting for a knock on the window that wasn't coming because nobody knew you were down there, because the tire tracks were filling in and the road was empty and the storm had cleared all witnesses before you had even arrived. She had never been in a car wreck, but she knew that feeling from other rooms, other darknesses. She knew it from the inside of a locked bathroom door. She knew it from a porch in January. She knew it from the specific quality of being in a situation that was hurting you and not being able to make anyone understand that it was happening. Reese Calloway grabbed the bent guardrail post with both hands and swung herself over the edge. The embankment was steep and the snow was thigh-deep and loose, more air than substance. And she went down fast once her boots lost the edge of the road. Branches caught her jacket and her hair snagging and releasing in rapid sequence as she half slid, half scrambled down the pitch. A buried root caught her left boot and sent her sideways for a scrambling moment, her hands grabbing at branches that bent and snapped under her weight without providing real purchase. She hit the bottom of the drop in a controlled fall that was not very controlled, rolling into a stand of sagebrush that grabbed at her clothing from every direction. She pushed upright, her breath coming in fast, shallow bursts that steamed in the cold air. The smell hit her before she fully found her footing. Raw gasoline, Swedish and chemical. The smell of something that should be contained and isn't. Antifreeze, a different sweetness underneath the artificial fruitiness of ethylene glycol mixing with the cold air. And something else beneath both of those, a hot metal smell oil burning off an exposed engine block that had been running when it hit something it couldn't pass through. The smell of a machine that had been running and was now very wrong. She followed the smell through the timber, pushing through branches that unloaded their accumulated snow down the back of her collar with each contact. The cold water running down her spine was a new and unwelcome addition to her situation. 50 yards into the dark space between the ponderosa pines, she saw it. The SUV was an older model, a heavy-bodied Yukon built in the era when trucks were made to be substantial. It lay on its driver's side against the base of a ponderosa pine, with a trunk as wide as a large refrigerator, the bark on the impact side stripped completely away, and the raw yellow wood beneath shining pale in the storm's diffuse light. The impact had been direct, and the tree had won comprehensively. The driver's side roof was compressed inward, the metal folded and torn along lines that followed no engineering intention. The front end was demolished, the hood driven back toward the windshield, the engine block displaced sideways from its mounts. One rear wheel was still spinning very slowly in the air above her, a lazy, meaningless rotation that would stop on its own when it was ready. Reese waded through the drifts that had already begun building against the vehicle's underside, her breath loud in her own ears above the muffled wind. She reached the windshield. It was gone. The safety glass reduced to a constellation of small cubes scattered across the disturbed snow around the front of the vehicle. Through the opening, she could see the driver, a heavy man in a heavy leather jacket, with a patch sewn across the back, the lettering partially obscured by the way he hung suspended in his seatbelt. His body rotated 90 degrees by the vehicle's orientation. His head rested against the caved-in roof pillar at an angle that told her something important before her hands had a chance to confirm it. The angle of complete and final rest. She reached through the broken frame. She pressed two fingers against the thick column of his neck below the jaw where the pulse was supposed to be. The skin was still warm against her frozen fingertips, warm enough that she kept her fingers there longer than she needed to, pressing harder, moving them slightly to different positions, the way she had been shown once during a mandatory first aid module in 8th grade health class. She moved her fingers twice, finding the same thing both times. The silence under her fingertips was absolute. Not the silence of a heart beating too faintly to detect. The silence of a mechanism that had stopped. The Ponderosa Pine had done its work quickly and completely. She believed that, and she held on to it. She pulled her hand back. She looked at her fingers for a moment, then wiped them carefully on her jeans. She looked back up the embankment, toward where she knew the road was invisible behind the timber in the falling snow. She thought about the walk she still had to complete. She thought about her left foot and the failing boot and the granola bars in her pocket and the arithmetic of surviving until nightfall. She said to herself quietly and without drama that there was nothing she could do for the man in the driver's seat. She said to herself that she needed to move now before the cold made the decision for her. Then she heard the sound from the back seat. It was small, smaller than she expected any human sound to be. Muffled by the barrier between the front and rear compartments, filtered through what she slowly understood was a heavy winter blanket that had been tossed over the back seat, possibly stowed there, and flung forward by the force of impact. But even through all of that dampening, the character of the sound was unmistakable. A child. Crying. Reese moved around the vehicle fast, her boots punching through the snow crust with each step. The rear passenger door was facing upward toward the gray sky now because the SUV lay on its side. She grabbed the handle and pulled. The door was jammed, the frame distorted by the impact, the mechanism binding in the bent steel. She pulled again with both hands, planting her right boot against the window frame below the door, using her legs to add force. The cold had gotten into the mechanism, and the damaged frame was holding it. And for a long moment, nothing happened except the sound of metal resisting and her own breathing getting ragged. She let go. She repositioned. She grabbed the handle again with her fingers wrapped all the way around it, her wrists cocked inward for maximum leverage, and she pulled with her back and her legs and everything she had in her frame that wasn't yet frozen. She felt something tear in her left shoulder, a hot, specific pain that ran from the shoulder joint up into her neck. She filed it in the category of things she would think about later and kept pulling. The latch gave with a sound like a single gunshot in the quiet woods, the door swinging up and backward on its hinges, and Reese went nearly over backward with it catching herself on the window frame with both hands at the last moment. She looked down into the overturned cab. There were two of them. She had expected one. The single small voice had implied one. But there were two, and the fact of it stopped her for a full second long enough to take them both in completely. Twin boys. 5 years old, maybe. Blonde hair plastered to their foreheads with sweat and tears. Wide blue eyes staring up at her from the dim interior of the overturned vehicle. They wore small denim jackets with something sewn on the back, a patch of some kind that Reese registered peripherally without processing. Because all of her attention was on the fact that neither boy had a hat or gloves, and the heater was dead, and the interior of the cab was already cold enough that she could see the small clouds of their breath in the dim light. The expression on their faces was one she knew well. She had worn it herself in different rooms at different ages. It was the expression of a person who has been alone with something terrible for long enough to stop expecting rescue and who is now looking at something that might be rescue and cannot yet commit to believing it. One of the boys, the one closest to her, was shaking hard enough that his teeth were clicking together in a rapid, involuntary percussion. "Uncle Walt won't wake up," he said. His voice cracked on the last word, his chest heaving against the harness that still held him in the sideways car seat. "It's really cold in here." Reese looked at him. She looked at his brother, who hadn't spoken, who was watching her with an expression of focused, silent attention. She looked at the dead heater and the missing windshield, and the snow already beginning to sift in through the broken glass. She said, "I know it's cold. My name is Reese. What's yours?" "Caleb," the shaking boy said. He pointed at his brother with a hand that trembled continuously. "That's Owen." "Okay," Reese said. She heard her own voice come out level and practical, the voice she used when things were bad, and level and practical were the only tools available. "Caleb, Owen, we're going to go for a walk now." The buckles on the car seats had frozen. The release buttons were plastic, and the cold had contracted them just enough to jam the mechanism, and her fingers were stiff and poorly responsive from the hours of exposure. She pressed the release on Caleb's harness 3 times without result, the button refusing to travel the necessary distance. She felt a cold spike that had nothing to do with the temperature, the specific cold of a plan beginning to fail. She looked around the interior of the overturned cab, her eyes moving fast across the available materials. The windshield was gone. There was safety glass everywhere, the small, blunt cubes of tempered glass scattered across every surface. But along the frame, there were still some larger pieces, fragments that had held together in the corners before the impact finished them pieces, with edges that had broken at angles rather than blunting. She found a piece maybe 4 inches long, one edge broken at an acute angle. She picked it up carefully between thumb and forefinger. She said to Caleb, "Don't look at the glass, look at my face." He looked at her face. She held his gaze and used the broken edge to saw at the nylon webbing of the shoulder strap, working back and forth, the fibers parting one by one in the cold, stiff material. It took longer than she wanted. Her fingers were slow and the nylon had hardened in the cold. But the shoulder strap gave then the lap belt, and she caught Caleb with both arms before he could tumble into the debris on the low side of the cab. He weighed almost nothing. That was her first thought. Her second thought was that he weighed exactly the wrong amount, light enough to be carried with one arm, heavy enough to change every calculation she had been running about the next several hours. She passed him up through the open door, setting him on the side panel of the overturned vehicle, telling him to hold the edge and not let go. Then she dropped back into the cab for Owen, who had watched the entire procedure without making a sound, and who grabbed at her jacket with both hands the moment she cut him free, holding on before she had a chance to catch him. Both boys were out of the wreck and standing on the exposed underside of the overturned Yukon in under 4 minutes. They stood close together, holding each other by the sleeves of their denim jackets, in the specific way of people who need contact and have learned to take it laterally rather than ask for it directly. Their faces were pale and wet with dried tears. Caleb's lips were already showing the first faint wrong color at the corners, a blue undertone that hadn't been there when she first saw him. They were dressed for a ride in a heated car. They were not dressed for what was about to happen. Reese stripped off the corduroy jacket. The wind hit her thermal shirt immediately hard and specific, a cold that carried intent. She wrapped the jacket around Caleb, rolling the sleeves up to free his hands, buttoning it across his narrow chest. It swallowed him completely. He looked like a child wearing a costume of someone much older, which in certain lights was accurate. She dropped back into the cab one more time. She tore the heavy rubber floor mat from the rear floorboards, working it free from the retaining clips, bending it double to break it loose from the frozen carpet underneath. She grabbed the long strip of nylon she had cut from Caleb's harness and a second length from Owen's side. She climbed back out. She knelt in the snow in front of both boys. The wind was driving ice crystals directly into her face at an angle that made her eyes want to close. She kept them open. "Here is what we're going to do," she said. She used the planning voice, the inventory voice, the voice that named things clearly because clarity was a form of control, when control was the thing you most needed. Owen, you're going to sit on this mat and hold the edges. Both edges. You don't let go for any reason. If you fall off, I won't know it happened, so you have to hold on. Caleb, you're going to get on my back. Arms around my neck, legs around my waist. Lock your ankles. Owen sat down on the mat without hesitation. He grabbed the edges with both hands, his knuckles going white. Caleb looked at her for a moment with those wide blue eyes. Then he climbed onto her back. She looped the first seatbelt length under Caleb's thighs and across her own shoulders, tying it across her chest in a knot. She checked 3 times with fingers that were becoming unreliable. She felt the weight settle. He was heavier than he looked, heavier than his thin frame suggested. She ran the math quickly, 40 pounds, maybe 45. Dead weight in deep snow. The number was correct. She chose not to let the number matter. She threaded the second nylon strip through the hole at the top of the floor mat and wrapped the other end twice around her right wrist. She stood up. The combined load hit her knees and lower back simultaneously. The floor mat's drag resistance added to the equation immediately, a constant backward pull. She stood in the wind for a moment and took full inventory of her situation, because inventory was not pessimism. Inventory was the first requirement of any plan. Left boot compromised, getting worse. Left foot wet, cold, the numbness working upward from the toes. Right hand wrist already aching from the nylon wrap. Left shoulder, the torn thing from prying the door, pulling hot with every movement. Body temperature, she still had reserves, but they were finite, and the rate of depletion was going to accelerate significantly once she stopped having the option of moving fast to generate heat. 2 children alive, cold, getting colder. 30 feet of embankment, then however many miles to the nearest shelter. She looked up the slope. "Hold tight, Caleb," she said. "We're going to climb now." The climb took 20 minutes and used her in ways she would understand more fully later. For every 2 steps she gained, the loose snow gave up 1 step beneath her, sliding back down the slope and taking her with it. She dug her free left hand into the slope where she could, grabbing at buried roots and exposed branch stubs, anything that offered purchase. Caleb held on without being told, his face pressed against the back of her neck, his small hands locked across her collarbone. Owen said nothing from the mat, but she could feel the drag and hear the scraping sound that told her he was still there. She reached the guardrail and pulled herself over it and dropped to one knee on the surface of Route 14. She stayed there for a long moment, her chest heaving, small dark points moving at the periphery of her vision. She waited for the spots to clear. She pulled Owen's mat up over the guardrail beside her. Then she stood up and looked at the road. The blacktop was entirely gone. There was no center line, no edge marking, no visible mile marker in either direction. The storm had replaced Route 14 with a continuous, featureless plain of moving white, bounded on either side by the blurred, dark suggestion of tree lines. The wind hit her full force on the open road, unobstructed by the timber, a sustained pressure against her chest that required conscious effort to stand upright against. Caleb raised his head from her neck. His voice was very small in the enormous noise of the storm. "My dad's going to come find us," he said. "He always comes." Reese looked east down the road toward the valley 20 miles away. She looked west up the road toward the summit and the elevation above. She thought about what she knew. The lower ground was too far on foot in these conditions, but she had passed a highway maintenance shed 2 or 3 miles to the west earlier in the day, a squat cinder block structure set back from the shoulder. The kind of building that existed in every mountain pass for the people who kept the roads open in weather like this. She did not tell Caleb that his father didn't know where they were. She did not say that the tire tracks from the accident were buried beyond recovery. She did not share the arithmetic she was running about exposure time and core temperature and distance. She tightened her grip on the mat strap. She said, "Hold on tight, Caleb. We're going to walk until we find somewhere warm." Owen looked up at her from the floor mat, his hands on the edges, his face pale and serious, and trusting in a way she had not earned and could not afford to examine. She turned into the wind. She took the first step. The wind on the open road was a different entity than the wind in the timber. In the trees, the gusts had been chaotic, coming from odd angles, turbulent and unpredictable. Out here on the exposed grade of Route 14, the wind had direction and purpose. It came from the northwest in a sustained organized column, a solid force she had to lean into at a constant angle just to move forward. The moment her posture shifted toward vertical, it pushed her back. She walked at a permanent tilt chin, tucked eyes narrowed to slits against the horizontal snow that arrived at her face with the persistence of something that had decided to find every available gap in her defenses. Caleb's weight on her back shifted with every step, the seatbelt strap digging into her shoulders and crossing her sternum in a line that restricted her breathing. She was taking shallower breaths at a higher rate, her body compensating. She knew this was metabolically inefficient. She did not have a better option. Owen rode the floor mat without complaint for the first half-mile. She could hear him back there, the scrape of rubber against packed snow, the occasional small adjustment of his grip. She called his name every few minutes to confirm he was present, and he answered each time with a single word. She accepted that as her monitoring system. At the mile-and-a-half mark, she introduced the game. She didn't call it a game. She just told them loudly enough to carry over the wind that she needed their help. She told them that the motorcycles their dad rode made a sound that could cut through anything, even weather this bad, and that if they both made that sound loudly and continuously, it would help her stay on the road. She needed the sound, she said. She needed it loud. Caleb started first. A low, chest-deep rumble, the serious effort of a 5-year-old committing fully to an imitation. Owen picked it up from the mat behind her, slightly higher in pitch, slightly rougher at the edges. The sound was thin and small against the scale of the storm, barely reaching her ears over the wind. But she could feel the vibration of it in Caleb's chest against her shoulder blades, and that vibration meant consciousness. And consciousness was the measurement that mattered most right now. Louder, she said. They went louder. She walked. At the second mile, she nearly walked into the metal post of a buried mile marker. She put out her left hand just before her face would have made contact, her palm taking the impact against the cold steel. She stopped. She turned back to Owen. His color was wrong. The blue she had noticed at the corners of his lips had deepened and spread, no longer a hint, but a definite wrong shade against the pale. His eyes were open and tracking, but the delay between her speaking his name and his eyes finding her face was measurably longer than it had been at the last check. She had no medical training. She had observation, which was a different and in some ways more reliable thing. She knew what she was looking at. She unzipped the thermal shirt without deliberating about it. The cold took her stomach immediately, a blade of a sensation that contracted every muscle in her abdomen. She reached down and took Owen's hands from the mat edges. His fingers were stiff and poorly articulated, like collections of wooden pieces loosely joined. She pressed his hands flat against her bare skin below her ribs. The contact made her whole core clench involuntarily, a deep spasm of cold that was violent and brief. She held his hands there through the spasm and kept them there after it passed. She counted 90 seconds. Then she pulled his hands out, pressed them briefly between her own palms, and tucked them inside the corduroy jacket crossed over his own chest. "Keep them there," she said. "Don't take them out for any reason." He nodded. The nod was slow, working at half speed. She picked up the mat strap and kept moving. The thermal shirt was wet now against her skin, the moisture working its way through the cotton. A wet thermal shirt in these conditions was worse than no shirt, the moisture conducting heat away from her body at a rate that bare skin and still air would not have matched. She understood this the way you understand things that you have no language for, but that your body has already calculated and reported. She walked faster. Moving faster generated heat. Moving faster also burned reserves she didn't have to spare, but the calculation resolved in favor of faster, and so she walked faster. At mile 3, Caleb stopped making the engine sound. Not the quiet of sleep, not the quiet of comfort. A specific alarming absence of sound from the small body on her back, the engine noise dropping away, the small adjustments of grip and position ceasing. She felt his head rest heavier against her shoulder, the weight shifting downward in the way of reduced muscle engagement. "Caleb," she said. Nothing. "Caleb!" Louder, sharper, a word with edges. A small sound came back, barely audible. But there, she stopped. She bent carefully forward to keep the strap tight and reached back with her left hand to press against his face. His cheek was cold against her palm, colder than it should have been, but when she pressed, he turned his face fractionally toward her hand. A reflex, something still responding. "Make the engine sound," she said. A pause, then, vroom. The word was nearly nothing, barely breath. "I can't hear you over the wind," she said. "Make it louder." Vroom, fractionally stronger. "Keep going," she said. "Don't stop." She walked. The engine sound became her vital sign monitor. A continuous low murmur against the back of her neck, uneven, sometimes fading to a level she couldn't hear, and could only feel as a vibration, but always returning when she called his name. She called his name at intervals she tried to keep consistent, because consistency was a form of reliability, and reliability was the thing she was trying to embody right now. Miles 3 through 5 were the longest of her life, measured against any other unit of time she had experienced. The grade steepened as Route 14 climbed toward the summit, the road rising in a long, steady pitch that increased the mechanical demand on her legs with every step. The snow on the road surface was deeper up here, the wind creating diagonal drifts across the pavement that rose to her knees in the worst sections. She had to lift her right leg high and drive it forward into each drift, breaking a path, then drag her left leg through the same channel. Her left foot had gone entirely numb at approximately mile 2. The cold had moved up past the ankle and into her calf, now a deep woodenness that felt almost comfortable by contrast with the sharp pain that had preceded it. She understood what that comfort signified. She accepted it as one more piece of information to be filed and not acted upon. She thought about small things as she walked. The specific sound of Owen's mat on the snow surface, the way it changed when the mat hit a buried crack in the pavement versus a buried rock. The weight distribution of Caleb on her back and how small adjustments to her forward lean changed the load on her lower spine. She thought about these things because they were immediate and real and required the exact amount of mental engagement available to her, leaving no surplus for the calculations that would not help her now. She did not think about how far it was to the shed. She did not think about what she would do if the shed was locked or if she had remembered its location wrong. She took the next step. At mile 5, she stopped for water. There was no water. She scooped a double handful of snow from the surface of a drift and held it against her stomach under her shirt, letting her body heat work on it. It melted slowly. She cupped the small amount of cold water to Caleb's mouth first, and then moved around to give Owen his share. It was not enough. It was what she had. Then mile 5 gave way to mile 6. And at mile 6, Reese Calloway's legs failed. It happened without drama or announcement. The glycogen in her thigh muscles, the fuel that had been powering the lifting and stepping and pulling for the last several hours, simply ran out. The mechanism stopped. Her knees bent and didn't unbend, folding her down into the snow with a slow, quiet inevitability that she barely had time to recognize before she was already kneeling. She landed on both knees. The impact jarred through her hips and spine, dulled by the cold. Caleb jerked against her back, startled, his grip tightening. The floor mat skidded forward on its strap, Owen's weight carrying it a few feet past her before the strap went taut. Reese knelt in the snow. The wind was lower down here, marginally. The drift she had fallen into surrounded her on 3 sides to waist height, and the reduction in wind exposure brought with it a reduction in the wind chill. And that reduction in wind chill meant the cold felt less aggressive, and the cold feeling less aggressive felt almost pleasant, which was the most dangerous thing she had experienced all day. She had read about this. A book with a cracked spine on a shelf in a foster house 2 placements ago, a wilderness survival manual that someone had bought and never opened. She had read it cover to cover on a Saturday when there was nothing else to do. The comfort that comes with advanced hypothermia is not comfort. It is the body beginning to withdraw from its extremities, consolidating its resources, preparing for a transition. The body deciding which systems it can afford to stop running. She looked back at Owen. He had turned on the mat to face her. His hands were on the edges, following her instructions even now, even at this distance. His face had gone past pale into the absence of color entirely, the skin a quality of white that suggested the blood had made a strategic decision to leave the surface. His lips were blue, not the faint tint she had noticed at mile 2, blue, and he had stopped shivering. That was the fact that reached through everything else and pulled her back. Not the cold, not the pain, not the weight of exhaustion. The fact that Owen had stopped shivering, which meant his body had crossed a threshold that she understood from that cracked spine book, and from 3 nights locked on a porch in January when the thermometer had dropped to 11 degrees. When the shivering stops, the body has made a decision. It is not the decision she was going to let Owen's body make. He is going to die if I stay on my knees. That was the first thought, and it was sufficient. The rest followed on its own, the tire tracks buried under 3 feet of snow, the wreck invisible from the road, the complete absence of anyone who knew where to look. She was the only reason those boys were still breathing, which meant she had to keep breathing first, which meant she had to stand up. This was not a heroic thought. It was not the thought of someone deciding to be brave. It was the thought of a girl who had survived every previous hard thing in her life by understanding with cold clarity which of the available options led forward and which ones didn't. She pressed her left fist into the snow, found the frozen pavement beneath it, and pushed. Her thighs locked. The muscles fired and seized simultaneously, cramps rolling through the quadriceps in waves that made her jaw clench. She pushed through them, her vision going gray at the edges. She rose 1 inch, 2 inches. Her right knee found the pavement, and she drove through it, her legs straightening by slow increments, her body rising from the snow like something that had been buried and had decided not to stay buried. She stood up. The wind hit her like it had been waiting for her return to full height. A gust that rocked her forward onto her toes and back toward her heels before she found her balance. She leaned into it. She picked up the mat strap in her right hand, the nylon cutting into the raw skin of her wrist. With a precision she filed away. She took a step. At mile 7, she made the decision about the shirts. Her thermal had been wet since mile 2. Wet against her skin in this cold was an accelerating loss she couldn't sustain much longer. She also understood, without wanting to understand it, that Owen's color was not recovering, and that a child sitting still on a rubber mat was losing heat faster than she was even accounting for her exertion. The numbers were clear. She stopped. She unzipped the thermal shirt and pulled it off over her head in one motion. The cold took her bare torso immediately and completely. Not gradually. All at once, a full-body shock that registered somewhere below sensation in the nervous system itself, a system-wide alarm that she acknowledged and bypassed. She passed the thermal shirt back to Owen. His fingers were too slow and too stiff to manage it alone, so she pulled it over his head. Herself worked his arms through the sleeves, pulled the hem down as far as it would reach over the corduroy jacket. She was now wearing a thin white cotton undershirt, sleeveless, the kind sold 3 to a package. It provided essentially no thermal barrier. She could feel the wind on her shoulders through it as if it weren't there at all. She walked. The seatbelt strap on her right wrist had been cutting through the skin for approximately 2 miles. She became aware of it specifically at mile 7 because the cold reached the raw skin and the exposed nerve endings that were more alert than the rest of her forearm. She wound the strap 1 additional loop around her palm to shift the pressure point. The signal reduced from specific to general, and she put it with the other general signals and kept moving. Mile 8 arrived and passed. Then the long approach to mile 9, each step identical to the last in the technique required and completely different in what it cost. She saw the maintenance shed first as a shape in the blowing snow, a darker rectangle against the gray-white background that was too geometric, too deliberate to be natural. She angled toward it with the careful skepticism of someone who had been misled by hope before, who understood that hope in a blizzard could walk you into a snowbank while you were looking at a shape that turned out to be a large rock. It resolved as she got close. Cinder block walls, concrete gray frost packed into every joint and seam. A flat roof with 18 inches of snow across it. A single steel door facing the road set into the front wall, secured with a heavy cast iron hasp in an old padlock. A maintenance shed. Real. Solid. Present. Reese reached the door and stood in front of it for a long moment. She just breathed. The building's mass broke the wind slightly on this side, not enough to feel warm, but enough to feel less violent. She pressed her forehead against the steel of the door for 3 seconds. The cold of it was different from the wind's cold. Solid. Fixed. The cold of something that wasn't moving. Then she tried the handle. The padlock was cast iron, an older design with a shackle that curved down through the hasp and held the whole assembly closed. She pulled at it twice. It didn't yield. She had expected this, and it didn't change anything. She swept her left boot through the snow at the base of the door, searching. On the third pass, her boot hit something that didn't give the way snow gives. She reached down and worked her hand through the powder until she found it. A chunk of broken asphalt from a shoulder repair, angular and heavy, roughly the size of her doubled fist. She picked it up with both hands. She swung it against the padlock shackle. The impact traveled up through her wrists and elbows and rattled her back teeth. The lock held. Again. Again. On the fourth swing, she felt a difference in the quality of the impact. A fractional change in the density of the sound, a suggestion that something inside the metal had shifted. She swung a fifth time with everything she had left, driving the chunk of asphalt into the shackle at the point where the previous strikes had concentrated their damage, and the shackle snapped. The sound it made was clean and high and final. The two halves of the broken shackle separated at the fatigue point, and the lock fell away from the hasp and disappeared into the snow. Reese dropped the asphalt. She pulled the hasp open and pushed the door. It scraped against the concrete floor inside with a sound that was the most significant sound she had heard in her 15 years. Not because it was musical or dramatic, because it meant that on the other side of this door was the absence of wind. The wind that had been working on her for the last 4 hours and 20 minutes had an end, and she had found it, and the door was open. She dragged Owen's mat through the door, first pulling it across the threshold and into the darkness. Then she stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her, dropping the broken hasp back into place. Complete darkness. Complete. The wind was gone. She stood still in the dark and listened to the silence of it, which wasn't silence. There was still the muffled roar of the storm outside, and the sound of Caleb breathing on her back, and Owen shifting on the mat, and her own heartbeat doing something irregular that she noted without concern. But the wind was on the other side of a steel door, and that was a boundary that had not existed 60 seconds ago. She unbuckled the chest strap. She bent forward carefully, and Caleb slid from her back, his hands finding her arm in the dark, his feet finding the floor. She walked him 2 steps and sat him down against the wall. She found Owen in the dark by touch and lifted him off the mat and sat him next to his brother. She could not see either of their faces. She could hear them both breathing. She ran her hands across Owen's face in the dark, found his cheek and pressed her palm flat. Cold. Very cold. But when she moved her thumb to the hinge of his jaw and pressed, he turned toward her hand. Still present. Still deciding to be present. She sat down on the floor in front of both boys. She pulled the corduroy jacket back off Caleb's shoulders, working by feel. She was down to the sleeveless undershirt. She stripped it off. Her back made contact with the cinder block wall, and the cold of it against her bare skin was a shock she absorbed without sound. She pulled both boys against her chest simultaneously, one on each side. Their cold entered her immediately, a two-way transfer that ran in the wrong direction for the first 30 seconds, their stored cold leaching into her before the differential began to work in the intended direction. She could feel the architecture of their rib cages against her skin, Caleb's heartbeat against her left forearm, rapid and faint. Owen gradually, and then more steadily, beginning to shiver against her right side. The shivering was the best thing she had felt all day. The shivering was the body deciding to fight. She pulled the corduroy jacket around all three of them, the fabric reaching approximately nowhere near sufficient coverage. She pulled the rubber floor mat across their legs. She curved her upper body over them, creating the smallest possible exposed surface area, her chin resting on the top of Caleb's head. From somewhere near her collarbone, Caleb's voice came up small and exhausted and still trying. Vroom, he said. It was barely a whisper. It was a question. Vroom, Reese said into the dark. Keep the engines running, Caleb. Don't let them stop. She felt both boys stir at the sound of her voice. She felt the small warmth of their breath rising against her neck. She felt her body pouring itself into them degree by degree, the heat she had generated through 4 hours of brutal exertion now flowing outward into the two small bodies pressed against her skin. Her eyes closed. She did not choose to close them. They close the way a door closes when the mechanism reaches the end of its range. She registered this as information. She understood what it meant. She did not have the remaining capacity to override it. She thought, stay awake. The thought was correct. She knew the thought was correct. She could not make it matter enough to act on it. She thought with the last functional piece of her mind that someone needed to know two boys were in a maintenance shed on Route 14. She thought about the convoy that Caleb believed was coming. She thought about a father who was out there somewhere not knowing where to look. She thought about 3 feet of snow covering the only evidence that anything had happened on this mountain today. Then she stopped thinking. The cold dark of the shed took her completely. The only sound in the world was the faint, fading engine rumble of two exhausted children pressed against the last warmth she had left to give. 60 miles south of Route 14 in the valley where the storm was bad, but not yet lethal, the Malone Charter compound sat behind its chain-link fence with the lights on in every window. Decker Malone had not sat down in 45 minutes. He stood at the far end of the main room with his phone in his right hand and his left hand flat on the pool table surface, not for support, but for the grounding contact of something solid beneath his palm. The compound's main room held 30 men, all of them in the particular stillness of people who are waiting for direction. Pool cues propped against walls, bottles set down and not picked back up. The low conversations that had been running all evening had stopped when Decker had slammed his phone against the bar top 20 minutes ago, and the crack of the impact had moved through the room like a physical command. Walt Briggs had picked up Caleb and Owen from their mother's house at noon exactly. Decker had confirmed the time with Sarah by phone. The drive from Sarah's house to the compound was 2 hours under normal conditions. It had been 5 hours and 22 minutes since noon. Walt's cell phone rolled directly to voicemail on the first ring, which could mean a dead battery or a tower outage, and the tower outages on the ridge above the pass had been confirmed by Highway Patrol. So that was possible. Possible was not sufficient. Walt Briggs had driven mountain roads in winter conditions for 22 years. He knew Route 14 the way other men knew their own living rooms. He would not park in a snowbank for 5 hours without sending some form of communication. He would not be 5 hours late delivering the president's children without accounting for it through every available channel. Walt Briggs was one of the most reliable people Decker had ever known, which was why he had trusted Walt with the most important cargo in his life. And the fact that Walt had not been in contact for 5 hours and 22 minutes in a storm with confirmed tower outages was still not sufficient. Highway Patrol says the pass is fully closed, Harlow said from the corner booth. He was delivering the information in the flat, careful tone of someone who understands that the person receiving bad news is also the person who will be determining the response to it. Plows were pulled back an hour ago. Zero visibility reported above the 4,000-foot mark. They're not sending anyone up until conditions improve. When, Decker said. The word was not a question. It was a measurement request. Earliest estimate is 4 in the morning. Decker looked at the clock above the bar. The second hand made a sound he had never noticed before tonight, a deliberate mechanical tick that was indifferent to the fact that 4 in the morning was 9 hours away. They have snowcats, he said. Not deployed, the storm moved faster than the models predicted. They're following protocol. A pause. The protocol exists for the safety of the crews. My sons are on that mountain, Decker said. He said it quietly, not to the room, not to Harlow specifically. He said it the way you state a fixed coordinate when you are navigating a reference point from which all directions are measured. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket and looked at Sutter, who was already standing near the door with his insulated gloves in one hand. Chains on the dually trucks, Decker said. Harlow radio every charter within 200 miles. Anyone with a four-wheel drive, a snowcat, or a heavy truck. Route 14. We start at the base of the mountain and we drive until we find them or the road stops us. If the road stops the trucks, we walk. No one in the room argued. No one suggested waiting or offered a counterpoint about road conditions or raised the question of liability. The men in the room had joined an organization that operated on a single foundational principle, and that principle was being invoked right now in its most literal form, and they understood that completely. Chairs scraped, gear was lifted from hooks and benches, the door opened, and the storm came in for 3 seconds, its cold and noise filling the room before the door closed again. The clock above the bar kept its indifferent tick. Within 10 minutes, 5 heavily modified diesel trucks with snow chains on all 4 wheels and extra fuel strapped to the rear bumpers rolled out of the compound and turned north toward the mountain. The convoy moved at 15 miles per hour where the road was legible and 10 miles per hour where it wasn't. Decker sat in the passenger seat of the lead truck and looked at the right shoulder of the road. He sat perfectly still and looked at the shoulder with the attention of a man who understood precisely what he was looking for, and precisely what it would mean if he found it, and precisely what it would mean if he didn't. Sutter drove with both hands on the wheel and said nothing. The heater ran at maximum, and the windshield slowly defogged from the bottom up, revealing the storm by increments. Harlow's voice came over the CB at intervals with charter locations and ETAs. More trucks were converging on Route 14 from 2 different directions. Decker registered this information and returned his attention to the shoulder. They were 40 minutes up the mountain grade, moving through conditions that were actively working to stop them, when Harlow's voice came over the CB with a different quality. Boss, left side, break in the tree line, fresh timber damage, big impact. Stop, Decker said. Sutter had already found the brakes. Decker was out of the passenger door before the truck fully settled, dropping into thigh-deep snow on the shoulder, pulling a high-powered spotlight from inside his jacket. He waded to the left shoulder where Harlow was already standing, his own light aimed down the embankment. The beam cut through the driving snow and illuminated a path of destruction through the timber. Large branches sheared clean, bark stripped from the near side of a massive ponderosa 60 feet below. And at the base of that tree, barely visible at the edge of the spotlight's range, a shape that was the wrong color and the wrong geometry for anything that belonged in a forest. That's Walt's Yukon, Harlow said. His voice had changed. Decker went down the embankment without preparation or ceremony. He slid the last 25 feet on the seat of his jacket, came up out of the snow at the bottom, already moving, and covered the 50 yards to the wreck in the particular stride of someone who has stopped being deterrable. He reached the driver's side. He looked through the destroyed windshield at Walt for 3 seconds. He looked away. He moved along the underside of the overturned vehicle to the rear. The passenger door was open, hanging backward from distorted hinges, the frame bent out of true. He climbed up the side panel and looked down into the overturned rear compartment. The car seats were there, both of them properly bolted, still secure, both empty. He dropped into the cab. He moved the spotlight across the interior methodically, the way you examine a scene that is telling you something important, and you need to understand all of it before you move. He picked up the nylon webbing hanging from Caleb's harness. He held it close to the light. The end was frayed and uneven, cut by something small and sharp that had worked hard to cut it. Not unbuckled. Cut. The second harness. Same. The left rear floor mat missing from its clips. A length of seat belt webbing also gone. Sutter had come down behind him. His light was sweeping the snow outside the vehicle. Decker, Sutter said. Come look at this. Decker climbed out and went to where Sutter was pointing his beam. The snow around the vehicle had been disturbed, filled in by subsequent accumulation, but still legible to someone who knew how to read disturbed snow. Boot prints. Small ones, and leading away from the vehicle toward the embankment slope, a dragging channel. Wide, the width of a floor mat. With a specific texture that meant something flat and rigid had been pulled across the surface. Alongside the drag channel, the compressed narrow channels of small boot prints, one of them leaving a pattern that indicated a compromised sole. Decker stood looking at these marks for a full 10 seconds. He had spent 20 years solving problems that didn't announce their solutions. He had learned to read evidence the way a good reader reads text, not word by word, but in blocks of meaning, the whole picture assembling faster than the individual pieces could be processed sequentially. He read the evidence in the snow, and the picture assembled. Someone small had come down this embankment. Someone small had cut his sons out of their harnesses with something improvised. Someone small had taken the floor mat and some seatbelt webbing and had gone back up the slope with two children and no resources in a full Wyoming blizzard. "These are a child's boot prints," Sutter said. He was not speculating. He was confirming what both of them were looking at. "These are not adult prints." Decker looked at the drag channel. He looked at the boot print alongside it. He thought about what it meant, the specific combination of those two things, the floor mat and the small boot prints and the cut harnesses, and the fact that his sons were not in this vehicle. He looked up the embankment. "West," he said. "Whoever this is went west. There's a state maintenance shed about 2 miles up the grade. It's the only shelter within range of anyone moving on foot in this." He went up the embankment. The convoy turned west. The men got out of the trucks and walked ahead of the lead vehicle in a line spread across the width of the road, spotlights sweeping the shoulders in overlapping arcs. The snow on the blacktop was knee-deep. The wind was still working. Decker walked in the center of the line and looked at the right shoulder with the attention of someone who understood that what he was looking for was small and covered and had been sitting in the cold for a long time. A mile and a half above the Yukon's location, the spotlight of the man on the far right edge of the search line caught a shape set back from the shoulder. Square walls, flat roof, the geometry of human construction in the middle of wilderness. Decker covered the distance between himself and the shed in 8 strides. The snow in front of the door had been disturbed, pushed aside in the specific pattern of someone who had stood in this exact spot and worked at something with both hands. The hasp on the door was open. On the ground below it in the snow, 2 halves of a cast iron padlock, the shackle snapped at a fracture point that showed the bright silver of fresh metal. Beside the door, half buried a chunk of broken asphalt. Decker took 1 step back from the door. He raised his right boot and drove it into the steel at the point just above the floor. The door banged open against the inside wall with a sound like a heavy book dropped on a hard floor. He went in. 5 spotlights followed him through the door. For a moment, they showed only the concrete walls and floor and the pallets of road salt stacked against the far wall and the rusted equipment stored along the sides. Then the beams converged on the back corner. Decker crossed the shed in 4 strides and dropped to his knees on the concrete. He moved the corduroy jacket first. It was laid over a shape in the corner, a shape that was 2 small bodies pressed against a third larger body, all of them tucked together in the specific configuration of conservation. The body on the outside had its back to the wall and its arms around the smaller 2 curved over them in the posture of final, complete, fully spent protection. He looked at the boys first. That was not a choice. It was what happened. Caleb's eyes opened slowly in the harsh convergence of the spotlight beams. Blue eyes finding the light, finding the face above it, finding his father's face. "Dad," he said. The word was barely sound. It was the size of a grain of sand and the weight of everything. Owen stirred on the other side of the protective curve of the girl's body. A small sound somewhere between a breath and a word, and then his eyes opened too. "They're breathing," Sutter said from behind Decker. His voice was doing something it didn't normally do. "Both of them, they're both breathing." Decker lifted Caleb from the corner and pressed his son against his chest. The leather of his jacket closed around the child's small, cold body. Harlow reached past him and lifted Owen, already pulling off his own lined coat to wrap the boy in it. Decker turned back to the girl. She was 15, maybe less. She was lying on her back against the concrete now that the 2 boys had been lifted away, her arms still positioned where they had been holding the children, not yet aware that the children were gone. Her torso was bare, the sleeveless undershirt gone, or never there. her skin a blue-white that Decker knew from cold, but had not seen on a living person, or not on one who had stayed living much longer than this. Her right wrist was the color and texture of raw meat where the nylon strap had worked through the skin. Her left foot was exposed, the boot destroyed the skin from ankle to toes, the wrong color, a dark and damaged wrong that he recognized. Her chest was still. Sutter said, "She's not breathing." Decker handed Caleb to the man next to him. He knelt beside the girl and pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck below the jawline. The cold of her skin was the cold of stone, the cold of a surface that has been absorbing winter for a long time. He held his fingers there, and he waited. One beat, faint, slow, irregular, present. Like a voice speaking from a very long distance, saying something that couldn't be fully heard, but couldn't be dismissed either. "She has a pulse," he said. He looked at her face. The bruise on her jawline had deepened into a full purple, the layered colors of an injury at least 24 hours old. The split in her lip was crusted with dried blood. These were not storm injuries. These were the injuries she had been carrying when she went down that embankment, when she cut his sons out of their harnesses, when she loaded them onto her back and walked 9 miles in a blizzard until she had nothing left to pour out of herself. He stripped his leather cut from his shoulders. He laid it across her bare chest. He slid his arms under her shoulders and beneath her knees, and he lifted her from the concrete floor with the careful, specific gentleness of someone handling something that has already paid more than it should have been asked to pay. "Heat the lead truck," he said, "all the way, right now." He carried her out of the shed and into the storm. The wind hit them both. He turned his body to put his back to the wind, shielding her face against his chest, and he walked toward the line of running diesel engines burning in the dark. The interior of the lead truck was a sustained blast of dry heat that smelled of melting plastic and old dust. Sutter had the climate control at maximum before Decker reached the passenger door. The windshield was completely fogged. The dashboard instruments glowed orange in the enclosed dark. Decker stepped up into the passenger seat with Reese in his arms and pulled the door shut with his boot. The storm cut off. The hiss of the vents and the idle of the engine replaced its sounds that were loud only in contrast with the complete silence of the storm's absence. He positioned her across his lap, her head in the crook of his left arm, her legs over the center console. She weighed almost nothing. Not in the sense that she was small, though she was small. In the sense that the frame of her beneath the skin was underdeveloped in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. The bones of her shoulders were prominent in his hands in the way of someone who had been chronically underfed over a long period of time in a way that was not accidental. His leather cut was across her chest. He tucked it tighter around her sides. In the dashboard's orange glow, her face gave him more information than he had been able to gather in the dark of the shed. The bruise at her jawline was larger than touch had conveyed, running from the hinge of her jaw down along the left side of her neck. In the dashboard light, he could see that it was a layered bruise colors at different stages of development, which meant it hadn't all happened at once. The dried blood on her lip was a darker color than the blood on her wrist, which told him exactly what it meant. The lip injury was older, predated, the storm predated everything that happened on this mountain today. She had come down that embankment already carrying someone else's damage. Sutter put the truck in drive, and the convoy began its descent. The chains found the packed snow and chewed through it in a grinding, purposeful rhythm. Decker pressed 2 fingers against her throat again. The pulse was there, faint, the same irregular flutter. He watched her chest for the rise and fall of breathing and found it shallow and far too slow but continuous. Her lips had gone from deep blue to a slightly less deep blue. The heat of the cab was working beginning at the surface. From the back seat, Harlow kept Caleb and Owen engaged with questions, the practiced technique of someone who understood that consciousness needed maintenance right now. Both boys were answering. Owen's responses were slow and had long gaps, but they were coming. Decker looked at the girl in his arms and thought about what he had read in the snow and what he had seen in the shed. He had spent 20 years as the president of the Malone Charter, operating according to a principle that he had articulated once and never needed to articulate again because it was self-evident to anyone who understood what the charter was. You don't leave your own behind. That was the whole principle. Simple enough to say in 6 words, complex enough to spend a lifetime working out the implications of. This girl was not his own. She had no connection to the charter. She had no history with any member. She was a 15-year-old runaway from somewhere on County Road 9 who had happened to be on Route 14 at 2 in the afternoon when a Yukon left the road. She had no claim on the principle that governed how the Malone Charter operated. And she had given his sons her last available degree of warmth. She had stripped the clothing from her own body in a Wyoming blizzard to keep 2 strangers alive. She had made that calculation, and then she had made it again, and then she had made it a final time when she stripped the last shirt from her back in a maintenance shed in the dark. He watched her chest rise and fall and thought about the principle and what it meant in its most complete form. Not the version of the principle that was convenient, the full version. The thinking resolved into a decision, not an announcement, not a plan that needed to be stated. A decision already made at the level below language, solid and quiet and complete. The hospital lights appeared in the windshield at 7:32. The sodium yellow of the parking lot flooding through the snow-covered glass as Sutter came down off the grade and found the valley floor road. "Call ahead," Decker said. "Severe hypothermia unresponsive. Frostbite left lower extremity. Tell them trauma bay's ready." Sutter drove the truck directly into the ambulance bay. He stopped with the front grille 2 feet from the sliding glass emergency room doors. Decker stepped down from the passenger door with Reese in his arms before the engine had fully settled. The cold outside was brief. The sliding doors were already opening, someone inside having seen the headlights come in hard and fast. He walked into the emergency room's white light and said without raising his voice that he needed a trauma team. The room organized itself around that request with the speed of people who had trained for it. A doctor in blue scrubs came from behind the triage desk at a controlled run with a gurney beside him. Decker laid Reese onto the mattress, keeping his hands under her shoulders and knees until the nurses had their hands on her. Then he stepped back. The team worked with clipped, specific efficiency. IV line into the back of her right hand. Warming apparatus inflated around her torso. Monitor leads attached. The doctor whose badge said Thatcher called out numbers and abbreviations in the quick, flat tone of acute care, and Decker translated enough to understand that her core temperature was critically low and that her heart was doing something that required immediate intervention. The gurney moved down the corridor at a near run. The double doors swung shut. Decker stood in the center of the emergency room and looked at the closed doors. He stood there without moving. Then he turned and went back out through the sliding doors to where Sutter was lifting Caleb down from the truck, and Decker took his son and held him with both arms against his chest, and Caleb put his face against his father's neck and breathed. And Decker stood in the ambulance bay with the tail end of the storm moving thin and cold across the parking lot and held his son and let the thinking stop for a while. The waiting room operated on its own time. Not slow, not fast. A different measurement, entirely granular and deliberate each minute, aware of being watched and arriving anyway. Decker sat in a plastic chair that had been designed for a different body type and occupied it completely. He had been in it for a long time. He had left it 3 times, twice to visit Caleb and Owen in the pediatric wing, once to stand in the parking lot with a cup of coffee in the pre-dawn cold, and look at the Wyoming sky after the storm had passed, the specific hard blue of a sky that has been scrubbed clean and doesn't apologize for what it cost. The pediatric report had been delivered by a young doctor with tired eyes who chose her words carefully. Mild hypothermia resolved. Frostnip on the ears and fingers, no lasting damage expected. Mild shock improving steadily. Both boys were awake and eating crackers from a paper bowl and asking with the persistence of 5-year-olds for a person named Reese. Owen had asked twice. Caleb had asked 4 times and then told the nurse that Reese was the one who made the engine noise game and that she had walked a really long way and she might be tired. Decker had said yes and held his sons and looked at them for a long time. He had gone back to the waiting room. Harlow arrived at the 2-hour mark with 2 styrofoam cups of coffee from the vending machine in the corridor. He handed one to Decker and sat in the adjacent chair, and they occupied the waiting room together in the correct way, which was without unnecessary speech. State troopers went back up with a recovery crew. Harlow said after a while. For Walt. Decker held his cup. They did an investigation at the scene. Harlow wrapped both hands around his own cup. The warmth of it seemed important to him. The lead investigator has been doing accident work for 16 years. He called me because he couldn't reach you. He said he needed to tell someone what he found down there because he wasn't sure anyone would believe it in a report. A pause. The drag channel from the wreck to the road. The boot prints. He measured the channel width and confirmed it was a floor mat with the weight of a child on it. He calculated the elevation gain between the wreck site and the road surface. He found where she went over the embankment on the descent and where she came back up. Another pause. She climbed 30 feet of loose snow slope with your son on her back and his brother on a mat behind her, in deteriorating visibility, with a boot that had no sole. Decker looked at his coffee. She had nothing, Harlow said. He wasn't performing the information. He was reporting it with the flatness of someone who had already processed it and arrived at something he couldn't fully articulate. No gear, no working phone, no knowledge of whose children they were or whether anyone was looking for them. The trooper said wind chill was in the single digits by the time she would have reached the shed. She was in a sleeveless undershirt. He stopped. She gave them everything on her body. Literally every layer. I know, Decker said. Social worker ran her name about an hour ago. Reese Calloway, 15 years old. She's in the system. 3 placements in the last 2 years. Current placement was Dale Pruitt on County Road 9. Harlow set his cup down. 2 prior reports of physical abuse against Pruitt. Both cases closed for insufficient evidence. The fluorescent lights in the waiting room made a sound when the room was quiet enough. A low, continuous hum that Decker had not noticed before this moment. The bruise on her jaw, Harlow said. That was from the night before the storm. She left after he hit her. Decker set his cup on the floor beside his chair. He looked at his hands, the ink across the backs of them, the rings he wore, the specific, capable weight of his hands in his lap. He stood up. He said to Harlow, "Get Sutter." Harlow looked at him. 14 years of working alongside this man had given him a precise understanding of the information encoded in those 2 words spoken in that tone. He did not ask for elaboration. "Give me an hour," Harlow said. At 4:15 in the morning, while Reese Calloway lay in the ICU with warm saline in her veins and a cardiac monitor tracing the slow, careful return of her heart to normal rhythm. 3 trucks from the Malone Charter turned off the county highway onto the gravel road that led to County Road 9. What happened at the house at the end of that road was not discussed in the waiting room or the hospital corridor or in any subsequent conversation that anyone reported to anyone else. What became known was what Sutter told Harlow over coffee in the hospital corridor at 7 in the morning, that Dale Pruitt had opened his front door at 4:15 and looked at what was standing on his porch, and that he had signed a document relinquishing his state guardianship rights in under 10 minutes, and that his truck had been seen leaving County Road 9 before 5 in the morning heading east, and that it had not returned. Did he ask why? Harlow said. Sutter considered the question for a moment. He didn't need to, Sutter said. On the morning of the 3rd day, the cardiac monitor in room 4 changed its rhythm. Decker had been in the chair beside the bed long enough that the chair's particular discomforts had become simply the conditions of sitting, no longer specific complaints, but background reality. He had learned the room sounds, the ventilator cycle, the monitor's tones, the particular quality of silence before a nurse entered. He had spoken once to Dr. Thatcher in the corridor outside the ICU, a conversation that had given him the information he needed and that he had been carrying since. Thatcher was a compact man of 60 who delivered medical information the way an experienced mechanic describes an engine problem, without drama and without false reassurance, with the respect of someone who believes accuracy is the most useful gift available. He had told Decker that Reese's core temperature on arrival had been 81 degrees Fahrenheit, that she had been in the terminal stage of hypothermic shock, that her heart had been running a ventricular arrhythmia that, without intervention, resolved within minutes to hours into cardiac arrest, that they had corrected the arrhythmia, that active internal rewarming had brought her core temperature to 95 degrees, that she was breathing on her own. He had described the foot. Grade 4 frostbite, the deepest classification damage extending through all tissue layers. They were administering vasodilators to attempt restoration of blood flow to the affected structures. The possibility of partial amputation remained. They would know more in several days. And then he had said something else in the tone of a man who had been in emergency medicine for a long time and had developed positions that the clinical literature didn't fully support, but that his experience insisted on. He had said that what the girl in room 4 had done was outside the physiological parameters of normal self-preservation behavior. The human body, Thatcher said, is engineered to protect its own core temperature above all competing priorities. It will sacrifice the peripheral tissues in the extremities and the surface systems in any order necessary to keep the core intact. What Reese had done was the deliberate reversal of that process. She had transferred her core warmth outwards systematically and intentionally over a period of hours. This, Thatcher said, was not something the body does. This was something the person inside the body does, and it left a different kind of mark. Decker had said thank you and returned to the chair. He was in the chair on the morning of the third day when the monitor changed. The rhythm had been running at a medicated 38 beats per minute for most of 48 hours, the deep sedation doing its metabolic work. When it shifted by increments, climbing through the 40s and into the 50s, the waveform altering in ways that Decker couldn't name technically, but could read clearly enough. He leaned forward. Reese's face changed first. The total stillness of deep sedation which had given her face the quality of an absence began to shift. The muscle at the jaw hinge tightened slightly. Her brow drew together in a small unconscious expression of effort or pain or the work of ascending. Her right hand moved, a reaching gesture that found nothing and subsided. Her eyes opened. Not cleanly. The lids parted unevenly, the eyes beneath moving in random arcs, before finding purchase on the overhead light before the processing engaged, and the arcs became intentional search. Decker sat forward. He kept his hands on his own knees. He kept his voice at its lowest register. Easy, he said. You're safe. You're in a hospital. Her eyes moved toward the sound. Focus assembled, slowly taking inventory. Ceiling tiles, monitor leads, IV line, large man sitting very still in a chair. He watched the inventory proceed and watched the expression change as it moved from location finding to something more urgent. She pulled her right arm back. The movement was strong and reflexive. The IV line pulling taut, her whole upper body trying to create distance from the large person beside her. The motion of someone whose body had learned through repetition that stillness near a large person was not reliably safe. Easy, Decker said, exactly as before. No change in volume or tone. He did not move toward her. He kept his hands on his knees. You're not going to be hurt. You're in a hospital. You're safe. She stopped pulling against the IV line. She lay watching him from across the bed, her breathing faster than the monitor preferred. Then she said in a voice so depleted it barely carried across the small distance between them. Caleb. One word. First word. Not a question about herself or her location or the machines attached to her body. His son's name. Down the hall, Decker said. He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who understood exactly what it cost her to ask that question and exactly what it would cost if the answer were wrong. Both of them. 0-2. They're going home tomorrow. The breath she released was not a normal exhalation. It was the release of something that had been held at high pressure for a very long time, a deflation that changed the physical shape of her. In the bed, her shoulders and jaw and chest all arriving at a different position, a position that was not braced. She closed her eyes. Not the closing of unconsciousness, the closing of someone who has received the one essential piece of information and can now allow their body to stop running toward it. Her lips moved. Decker leaned forward slightly. Vroom, she said, barely breath. A private word addressed to no one in the room and to two boys down the hall who couldn't hear it, and to the necessity of engines that keep running even when the fuel is almost gone. We made it. The engines are still running. He sat with what that word meant for a moment and did not examine it too closely. She rested. She didn't sleep, but she didn't speak either. The monitor ran its steady improving rhythm. The morning light came through the edges of the horizontal blinds in thin bright lines across the linoleum. After a while, she turned her head on the pillow and looked at the ceiling with the unfocused attention of someone running an internal accounting. Then she spoke without looking at him. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said. The words carried the flatness of logistical fact. Not self-pity, not a request. The clean statement of a real condition that needed to be acknowledged before anything else could be built on top of it. "You can tell the county people I'm okay. I'll figure something out." He looked at her profile. The bruise on her jaw in the morning light was fully developed now, the outer edges going yellow in the way of healing, the center still deep. The topography of someone else's choices preserved on her skin. "The social worker ran your name," he said. She closed her eyes, a different kind of closing. "I'm not going back there," she said. "I'll leave before my foot heals. I've done it before." "You're not going back," he said. She opened her eyes and looked at him. He held the look and let the words carry what they needed to carry without adding anything to them. "Some of my brothers visited that house 2 nights ago," he said. "They had a conversation with the man who lived there. He signed a document giving up his placement rights." He paused. "He also left the state. He won't be coming back." She looked at him for a long time. He watched the disbelief, then the testing, then the slow and careful arrival of belief. The kind of belief that comes in through the back door in people who have learned the front door leads to disappointment. "Why?" she said. Not a full question. A question containing many questions, all of them versions of the same thing. He had heard it before in different rooms from different people, and he had only ever had one answer for it. "Because you bled for us," he said. "That's the rule. You carried my blood 9 miles in the dark. You gave everything you had on your back and your body to keep my sons alive. You paid a debt you didn't owe." She looked at the ceiling. He stood up. He walked to the window and pulled the horizontal blinds open with one hand. The morning light came fully into the room. "Can you sit up?" he said. She pushed her elbow into the mattress and raised herself slowly, her face tightening with the effort. She came up enough to see past him to the parking lot below. The parking lot was not empty. The rows of vehicles stretched from the ambulance bay at the near end to the perimeter fence and beyond it onto the service road. Motorcycles, hundreds of them, lined in formation with the precision of people who organize out of respect rather than requirement. The chrome catching the winter morning light in long horizontal lines. Heavy trucks at the perimeter. Men in leather standing by their machines, some in small groups, some alone. All of them facing the hospital building in the posture of people who have decided that waiting is the point. Burn barrels at intervals threw thin, straight columns of smoke into the cold, still air. The storm was completely gone. The sky above the valley was the particular absolute blue of Wyoming winter after a front has passed and taken everything unclear with it. As the blinds opened, a man in the front row of the lot looked up toward the window. He raised his right fist into the air. The man beside him raised his. The gesture moved outward in both directions, simultaneously traveling through the rows in a wave that expanded until the air above the entire parking lot was filled with raised right fists. Hundreds of them, directed at a single third-floor window. No shouting, no engines revving, no sound at all. Just the silent, enormous, deliberate statement of 700 people who had driven through the end of a blizzard to stand in a parking lot in the cold and say something that didn't need words to be said. Reese sat in the hospital bed and looked at it. He watched her face while she watched them. He watched the moment it reached her when the understanding of what she was seeing moved from her eyes into something deeper. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes went bright. The tears came without sound, without performance, simply the unstoppable arrival of water at the surface of a face that had been holding itself in constraint for longer than 15 years of living should have required. She put her right hand over her mouth and cried without making a sound, the way you cry when you have learned that crying out loud didn't change anything. and the only kind that remained was the quiet kind. He reached into his jacket pocket. The bracelet was braided dark leather with a small solid silver skull set into the center. The skull worn smooth from handling no larger than a thumbnail. It had been in his pocket since the morning after the shed, since he had sat in this same chair, looking at this same face, and the decision had finished assembling itself below the level of language. He placed it on the blanket in front of her. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. "You don't run anymore, Reese," he said. His voice was steady. "You're home." She picked it up with her right hand. She held it between her fingers and looked at it with the expression of someone holding an object whose weight is not physical and has no equivalent. The bracelet sat in her palm. She turned it over once, twice, feeling the braid of the leather and the small weight of the silver at its center. Then she put it on her right wrist, working the clasp with fingers that still didn't bend all the way. It took 3 tries. When it was on, she looked at it. She looked at it the way you look at something you are going to need to grow into something that is the right size for who you are going to be. Outside the window, the fists stayed raised for a while longer. Then one by one, the men in the parking lot began to lower their arms, unhurried in the way of people who have finished saying what they came to say and are at peace with the saying of it. Decker stood at the window and watched them. Reese lay back against the pillow and closed her eyes. The monitor ran its steady, improving rhythm. The morning held still for a while before it moved on into the day. A year is a specific thing. It has a beginning and an end. And in the middle of it, if you are paying attention, you can feel the particular texture of time moving at exactly the rate that allows things to change when they are allowed to change. Reese Calloway paid attention. The left foot healed slowly and not completely, which is the only way that kind of damage heals. There was a scar along the outer edge where the deepest tissue damage had been a ridge of pale skin that was sensitive to cold in a way the rest of her foot was not. She wore her boots a half size larger on that side to accommodate the way the cold had rearranged the structures of her toes. But she walked without a limp by March, which Dr. Thatcher had described as medically improbable, using the tone he reserved for things that the literature predicted but the patient disproved. She ran on the flat gravel of the compound lot by May, carefully watching the left foot on uneven surfaces. By September, she could stand on the concrete floor of the garage for a full 8-hour day without the foot becoming an issue she had to manage. The garage was where she spent most of her time and where most of what needed to happen happened. It was a long cinder block building at the back of the compound, 4 bays wide, smelling permanently of motor oil and brake cleaner, and the warm metallic smell of engines that had been running within the last several hours. Vance, who had been working on engines for 30 years and who taught primarily by pointing at things and waiting, had started her education in February with the fundamental vocabulary, oil changes, tire rotations, the taxonomy of hand tools, and what each one was actually for rather than what it was called. He had a theory that most mechanical work was about listening, that a machine told you what was wrong before it broke down completely if you knew how to pay the right kind of attention, and that the only way to develop that attention was to do the work slowly and repeatedly until the sounds became a language. Reese took to this naturally. She had been learning to pay the right kind of attention to what things were saying before they said it directly for most of her life. The skills transferred. By summer, she was doing brake jobs without supervision, the diagnosis and the replacement, and the road test all her own. By the end of August, she was diagnosing electrical faults, which Vance considered the true benchmark, because electrical faults required listening to absence rather than presence, silence rather than sound, which was a harder thing to teach than anything mechanical. She was good at listening to absence. She had been learning that in different rooms for years. Caleb and Owen came to the garage after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. This had started as an occasional visit, Decker dropping them off while he handled compound business, and had become over several months a routine as established as any other part of the compound's rhythms. On the Tuesdays, she ran late. She could sometimes hear them before she saw them, their voices coming through the side door 30 seconds ahead of them, arguing about something that was completely serious and fully resolved by the time they came through the door. Caleb established himself on the red toolbox beside the lift when she was working on elevated vehicles. He watched from above with the careful attention of someone building an inventory, and he asked questions continuously. What does that do? Why is that part that color? What happens if you put it back without tightening it all the way? And she answered each question with a real answer, not a simplified version, not a deflection. He was 5. He could handle real answers if you chose the words with care. Owen was quieter. He had always been quieter than his brother, which was not a deficit, but a different mode of engagement. He kept a small notebook now, a blue composition book he carried in his jacket pocket, and he sat on the second step of the garage stairs and made drawings of the equipment and the vehicles and the people working on them. He showed her the drawings sometimes without comment, just held the notebook up so she could see the page. And she made a point of looking at them carefully and saying something specific rather than something general. I like how you got the angle of the lift arm. You got the shadow right on the fender. He would take the notebook back and add something to the drawing, a small adjustment toward accuracy. She lived in the room above the compound's main building. It had been a storage space and was now a room with a window that faced south toward the valley floor and a wood stove in the corner that she had learned to bank correctly before the first hard frost of the following November. Her possessions were few, and she kept them organized the way people keep their possessions when they have learned that having few things is not a deprivation if the things you have are the right ones. She had the braided leather bracelet on her right wrist every day. She had 3 photographs framed that Decker's wife Mara had given her. Mara had returned from her sisters in Nevada in December and had taken to Reese with the direct, unsentimental warmth of a woman who had already decided her position before arriving and didn't require additional information to confirm it. The first photograph was Caleb and Owen asleep in the back seat of the compound truck, taken sometime in spring. Their heads angled toward each other in the way of people who have been sleeping side by side for as long as they can remember. The second was the garage in early morning light before anyone arrived. The lift arms raised the quality of the light at that hour, making the empty garage look like something that was waiting for the day to start. The third was Reese herself at the workbench, a carburetor in her hands, and grease on her forearm, and her attention entirely on what she was holding. Her face unguarded in the way of a person who doesn't know a photograph is being taken. She had looked at that photograph for a long time when Mara gave it to her. She had looked at the face in it and worked on understanding it as the face of a person who existed in a specific place and was known by the people in that place and was not in the process of leaving. That understanding was coming. It was taking the time it needed to arrive, which was the only speed at which real things arrived. The first hard snow the following November came on a Tuesday. She was finishing a timing belt replacement on a charter member's truck. Her hands inside the engine bay, the work requiring a specific kind of focused patience, because a timing belt installation done incorrectly is a problem that announces itself destructively and without warning. The light in the garage changed at about 3 in the afternoon, going flat and gray in the way that preceded weather. And through the high windows near the roofline, she could see the first flakes moving horizontal against the darkening tree line to the north. She watched the snow for a moment. She always watched it now, the first snow of each season, with the specific attention she gave to the things in her life that had changed her. Not fear, something closer to acknowledgement. The recognition of a force that had been in a direct conversation with her and that she carried evidence of in the scar along the outer edge of her left foot, and in the particular quality of her attention when the temperature dropped and the sky went the specific gray that preceded a front. She wiped her hands on the shop rag and reached for the timing belt tensioner. The side door opened. She thought it was Caleb and Owen. Tuesday was their day, and she was already beginning to shape the explanation of the timing belt into vocabulary appropriate for 5-year-olds, which was not dramatically different from regular vocabulary if you selected the words with precision. But the footsteps were wrong. Single set, not two, and carrying a quality she parsed before she turned around, heavier than a 5-year-old, lighter than it should have been, the particular footfall of someone trying to take up as little sonic space as possible. She turned around. A boy, 12 years old, maybe 13, in a gray zip-up hoodie that had not been designed with November in Wyoming in mind. No hat. Sneakers with laces that had broken and been knotted and broken again at the knot. He had stopped just inside the door and positioned himself against the wall in the way that she recognized from the inside, the way of making yourself small against a vertical surface, because small tends to draw less. His eyes were on the floor, not the floor of someone who is shy or uncertain in the ordinary way, the floor of someone who has practiced directing their gaze downward because direct eye contact has historically not been predictably safe. She recognized that practice from the inside too. She set down the tensioner. She walked across the garage floor, her boots making their sound on the concrete, and she did the thing that someone had done for her in a cold, dark room in a building off Route 14. The thing that had mattered more than anything that came after it. She crouched down in front of him, bringing herself below his eye level, removing herself from the position of height. She waited. He looked up. His eyes were dark brown and tired in the specific way of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep, a tiredness that lives deeper than the surface, the tiredness of someone who has been managing a difficult situation for longer than they should have been asked to manage it. She knew that tiredness. She knew it as well as she knew the temperature of something she had already held in her hands. "Hey," she said, "what's your name?" He looked at her with the guarded assessment of someone calculating whether the question was safe to answer, which is a calculation that no 12-year-old should be practiced at, but some of them are. Then he told her. She nodded. She stood and walked to the wall heater and turned it up and pulled the spare stool from under the workbench and set it next to the heater close enough that the warmth would reach it directly. "Come sit down," she said. "It's cold out there." He crossed the garage floor and sat on the stool. He pulled his knees up and wrapped his arms around them, making himself compact in the way of people who conserve warmth and space simultaneously. She went back to the timing belt. She worked with her back at an angle toward him, which she had learned was less confrontational than facing someone directly when they were still deciding whether the inside was safe. And she said without turning around that he didn't have to talk if he didn't want to. She said the heater took a few minutes to really get going. She said there was food in the main building, and she could take him there whenever he wanted, or they could just stay here a while. She heard him shift on the stool. She heard him let out a long, slow breath, the kind of breath a person releases when they have been holding it for a long time and have decided tentatively that this might be a place where it was permissible to stop holding it. She kept working. Outside the high windows of the garage, the snow came down in the flat gray light of a Wyoming November. The same mountains, in the same pass, in the same sky that had been present at the beginning of all of this, and beneath them, a garage with a heater running and two people in it, one of them working on an engine with careful hands, the other sitting on a stool near the warmth, both of them present in the same room in the same moment, which was the whole thing. That was the whole thing. She had walked 9 miles in the dark to learn what it meant to not look away from what needed to be seen. She was still learning it. She would keep learning it. In garages and in corridors and in every cold doorway where a person was standing who needed someone to crouch down and ask their name and wait. Family doesn't always begin with blood. Sometimes it begins with a decision made in a blizzard by a person who had nothing except the knowledge of what it cost to be left in the dark. Sometimes it echoes forward in the way that real things echo, not losing itself with distance, but finding new surfaces, new rooms, new cold children at new doors. Sometimes it begins again every time someone decides not to look away.